Let's talk about a war that lasted less than a week, but whose aftershocks are still being felt today. We're talking about the Six-Day War of 1967. So how on earth did just 6 days of fighting completely change the map and the future of one of the most contested regions in the world?
Just look at this. This map tells a pretty incredible story. Before the war, Israel is that small sliver of dark green. But in just 132 hours, that's it. It seized all the surrounding territory you see here. We're talking the Sinai Peninsula, Gaza, the West Bank, and the Golan Heights. The real question is, how is a victory this huge and this fast even possible? All right, so to get our heads around this, we need to rewind a bit, back to the end of the 1956 Suez Crisis. For about 10 years, you had this really tense peace, basically held together by UN peacekeepers who were acting as a buffer in the Sinai. But, and this is the key, that peace was like a house of cards, just waiting for a breeze to knock it all down.
And in May of 1967, that breeze turned into a hurricane. I mean, the speed of this escalation is just breathtaking. First, Egyptian troops start pouring into the Sinai. Then, Egypt's President Nasser tells the UN peacekeepers to get out, pulling away that buffer. Then, he inks a defense pact with Jordan. The dominoes were falling, fast. But the final straw, the one that really made war seem inevitable, came on May 22nd.
On that day, Egypt shut down the Straits of Tiran. Now, this was a huge deal because it choked off Israel's only southern sea route. For Israel, this wasn't just an economic move, it was an act of strangulation. It was what's known as a casus belli. That's just a formal term for an act of war. And Israel had made it crystal clear years before that this was a red line you just don't cross.
And you know, this wasn't just Israel's opinion. The American president, Lyndon Johnson, basically said the same thing. He called it a single act of folly that led to the explosion. So pretty much everyone on the world stage knew this was a massive escalation. You could feel that war was just around the corner.
But if you were a betting person, just looking at the numbers, you would not have bet on Israel. On paper, the odds were completely stacked against them. The combined Arab armies had way more troops, 3 times the number of tanks, and almost triple the aircraft. Just looking at this, an Israeli victory seemed like a long shot, never mind the kind of lightning victory that was about to happen.
So, what do you do when you're that outnumbered? Well, Israel's entire strategy hinged on one thing, landing a devastating knockout punch with total and complete surprise. And that brings us to the opening moments of the war.
Picture this. It's the morning of June 5th. As sirens are blaring across Israel, the Israeli Air Force launches something called Operation Focus. We're talking almost every single fighter jet they had, screaming into the sky. They flew super low over the Mediterranean to duck under Egyptian radar. Their one and only target? The entire Egyptian Air Force.
And the result? It was absolutely staggering. In just the first few hours of the conflict, Israel destroyed 338 Egyptian aircraft. Let's be clear, this was not a dramatic dogfight in the sky. This was the systematic obliteration of an air force while it was still sitting on the ground. Most of those planes never even got a chance to take off.
I mean, you really can't overstate how important this first strike was. By taking out the planes on the tarmac, Israel had won total control of the sky on the very first morning of the war. For all intents and purposes, the air war was over before it even really started. It was game over.
And here you see it perfectly, the cause and the effect. On the left, you have the tool, the French-made Dassault Mirage 3 jet, a top-of-the-line aircraft in the hands of incredibly well-trained pilots. And on the right, you have the result, the utter devastation of Egypt's much, much larger air force. It was a perfect storm of technology, training, and a ridiculously bold plan.
So how did they pull it off? Well, it was a whole mix of things. That low-level surprise attack was crucial. But then, in a wild stroke of luck for Israel, Egypt had actually turned off its own air defense system that morning. Apparently, they were worried their own guys might shoot down a plane carrying some of their top generals. You can't make this stuff up. Add to that weak defenses at the airfields and Israeli pilots who could refuel and rearm in minutes, and you have the recipe for a perfect first strike.
Okay, so with the skies now completely clear of any threat, Israel's ground troops had a massive advantage. They can now advance without ever having to worry about an attack from above. And that advantage was about to become just as decisive in the desert.
And Israel's plan on the ground was just as gutsy as its plan in the air. They weren't just going to run headfirst into Egypt's fortified positions. No way.
Instead, they launched this complicated three-pronged attack designed to get around the Egyptian defenses and surround them.
See, the Egyptians had basically fortified the front door. They figured any attack would come right down the main roads. What they never saw coming was an attack through parts of the desert they thought were totally impassable. Israel came in through the window, and that element of surprise was absolutely everything.
And again, just look at the raw numbers here. Even just on the Sinai front, Egypt still had more troops and more tanks. But as they were about to find out, those numbers don't mean much when you have no air cover and your enemy has completely outsmarted your defenses.
The whole Israeli ground war was about speed and agility. Their forces just blitzed through the desert, blowing past heavily defended spots and creating chaos deep in the Egyptian rear. It's like they had this protective umbrella from their own air force the entire time, letting them move with a speed the Egyptian army just couldn't handle. But the real turning point in the Sinai wasn't a battle, it was a single command. The Egyptian field marshal heard that a key position had fallen, and he just panicked. He ordered a full, chaotic retreat of all his forces from the Sinai. This wasn't a strategic withdrawal, it was a rout, and it turned a defeat into an absolute catastrophe for the Egyptian army. And just like that, by June 10th, the fighting was done. Egypt, Jordan, and Syria had all agreed to a ceasefire. The guns fell silent. But the consequences of those 6 short days were just beginning, and they would be just as massive as the victory was quick.
The new reality on the ground was stark. In less than 1 week, Israel had more than tripled in size. It now controlled the Sinai Peninsula and Gaza from Egypt, the West Bank and East Jerusalem from Jordan, and the strategically vital Golan Heights from Syria. The map was completely transformed.
So here we are, right back at the map we started with. But seeing it now, knowing how it happened, the sheer scale of this change is even more mind-blowing. Those old 1949 armistice lines, they were basically erased from history, replaced by this new map that has defined the region ever since. Of course, a victory like this always comes at a human cost. But the difference in casualties was just immense. Israel lost just under 1,000 soldiers. The Arab armies, they lost well over 15,000. That huge gap really tells the story of how effective that initial surprise attack truly was. And the story doesn't end with the soldiers, not even close. The war created a massive new refugee crisis. Something like 400,000 Palestinians and Syrians either fled or were forced from their homes in these newly occupied territories. This created a huge human and political problem that, as we know, remains unresolved to this very day. So in the end, you have 6 days of fighting, followed by more than half a century of consequences. The occupation of land, the refugee crisis, the complete shift in power in the region. It all started in that one single week. And it leaves us with this one haunting question. How is it that a single week, so long ago, continues to echo so powerfully in the headlines we read today?